In this second look at glaciation, we will be covering the nature of the Holocene Epoch, which marks the end of the most recent ice age. We'll also be taking a look at some of the human responses to changes in global climates associated with this transition. Additionally, we will be taking a look at glacial landforms, both erosional and depositional. The Holocene epoch is considered to be the modern epoch. It begins approximately 10,000 years ago. As is the case today, this epoch is characterized by a constant glacial recession. The landforms that we associate with glacial recession dominate our geological history for this period of time. So there was a significant warming trend globally with regard to climates, and the glaciers, in a sense, are a natural record for this warming process. The paleoanthropology of these last 10,000 years has reflected not only human responses to this new climate type or this changing climate, but also the responses of a variety of plants and animals. Anthropologists recognize 5 responses made by humans and measured in terms of human culture to the changing climate of the end of the Pleistocene and the new climates that we see associated with the Holocene. First, people changed their subsistence focus as animals and plants on which they had previously relied became either extinct or physically unavailable. Second, different human groups responded differently to the new environmental conditions on a global scale. This resulted in a far higher level of cultural diversity. Third, in many areas, this subsistence shift, which I mentioned in relation to the first response, included exploiting a broader range of resources such as small game, fish, shellfish, and bird. In some regions, plant foods were available as part of this postglacial environment as well. And again, all of this is being derived from what we have in terms of the archaeological record. Fourth, in certain regions of the planet, the subsistence shift involved an intensification in terms of the exploitation of plants and animals. And some uniquely productive elements began to work their way into the diets of individuals. Fifth and finally, in even other places, the focus on certain abundant resources encouraged a shift from a nomadic existence to a more sedentary one. In some particularly rich areas, intensification of the food quest and the shift to a sedimentary way of life set the stage for a revolutionary change in the relationship between people and food, a shift in this case from food collection to food production. So the history of agriculture as we know it today, the intensive domestication and use of both plants and animals, really is part of this transition from the Pleistocene, the end of the last ice age, and the start of the Holocene, or this modern epoch. And when we take a look at agriculture in general as a kind of unique human technology, a very important part of our culture globally today, we realize that this is a byproduct of the changing climates and the availability of new environments. Now let's take a look at some of the landforms of the Holocene. And again, when you think about the landscapes that we look at today, much of these landscapes were either directly or indirectly impacted by the work of glaciers. The way in which a glacier erodes the land is similar to a large-scale excavation project. It actively lifts and transports debris. This debris is derived from the glacier's mechanical plucking or the rock material from the surrounding environment associated with a glacier's origin or the path of a glacier. Glacial transport can occur as a visible moraine lying atop the glacial body, or it can occur englacially as material is carried within the body of the glacier. Materials can even be plucked from below the glacier and carried as embedded materials within a basal surface, or the actual base surface of the glacier itself. Often it is the case that the materials plucked from below and moved again as part of this basal surface uh, will act as abraders, actively gouging and scouring the Earth's surface below. In some instances, a glacial polish can be created with clastic materials of sand or silt in terms of their texture, as they are again embedded on the bottom and as the glacier is riding over other bedrock, exposed bedrock, for example. Glacial landforms in this new Holocene epoch again fall into two camps, just as glaciers themselves fall into two camps. We see landforms associated with alpine glaciation, and we also see landforms that are associated with continental glaciers. Now let's take a look at the work of William Morris Davis and some of the erosional landforms associated with alpine glaciers. Within the geological geosystems of the Canadian Rockies, the Swiss Alps, and the Himalayas, we see these landforms. Geomorphologists such as William Davis become important again for how they are able to decipher the nature of glaciation from these postglacial environments. His work falls into the early 20th century, and he was again looking at landforms associated with this alpine group. What were these alpine glacial landscapes? Well, they included glacial erosion and transport that actively removed local regolith and soils that covered them. So you were seeing a lot of erosional landscapes. They included cirque walls that were removed in the work of these alpine glaciers, creating sharp ridges or arêtes. So arêtes become these sawtooth structures of glacial mountains. There were structures that were associated with the intersection that we see between generally cirque glaciers. These are referred to as horns, these pyramidal peaks that result when several of these cirque glaciers gouge into a individual mountain summit from one or two or more slope faces. Additionally, when glacial bodies disappear from a local landscape, there are structures that become visible. And of course, William Morris studied this. The glaciated valley, for example, takes on a U-shaped appearance, possessing very straight sides. Physical weathering from the associated freeze-thaw cycle of an alpine glacier also becomes visible in these valley environments. Talus slopes appear as weakened regolith continues to erode and deposit itself into these U-shaped valleys. Tarns may also form. These are small mountain lakes that demarcate the physical starting point or accumulation zones of alpine glaciers. These tarns, if they emerge in a stair-step fashion, where several lakes create a steep chain of water bodies, we see the development of what are referred to as paternoster lake systems. In Latin, paternoster translates roughly to our Father, a term that's become synonymous with the Roman Catholic prayer bead system. And so these paternoster lakes have the appearance of, again, prayer beads as one of higher elevation begins to empty itself into one of slightly lower elevation as they again move down through these once glaciated valleys or valley systems. So all of these landforms that we associate with the alpine group are things that you will see in your readings, and there are a variety of additional photographs and diagrams that are important resources to reflect on as you are reading the material for this section of the course. You can compare them to this diagram, and you'll see this diagram presented to you two more times in this lecture. You can compare it to some of the resources in your textbooks. This would give you a kind of before version or a visual aid for understanding what's occurring during glaciation in an alpine environment, and then you can compare this to what you see when the glacier is no longer present. And that contrast is really important because it's that contrast that gives us this second part to our understanding of the overall impact that glaciers have made in many of our northern and southern hemispheric high elevation environments. We also have depositional landforms that are associated with alpine glaciation. Glaciers in this case produce a different set of landforms when they melt and deposit their debris, that material that they bring along with them from their origin and the paths that they take as they move from areas of high to low energy. And one of the things that we see as a trend in these depositional landscapes is that there will be retreats and expansions of the glacial body. And when we see these retreats and expansions, they will occur in a very repeated fashion. These deposited landforms include things like glacial drift, the general term rather for all glacial deposits, both sorted and unsorted. They also include sediments that are deposited by glacial meltwater that are sorted by size and are termed generally as stratified forms of drift. They also include direct ice deposits without a great degree of water action. These are referred to as till. So in a sense, there's three kinds of materials or categories of materials. We have glacial drift, we have stratified drift, which can be absorbed or included in the term glacial drift, and then also till. And all of this material, in a sense, as a glacier flows to a lower elevation, is carried along or it's entrained in the glacial body or on its surface. Another category of material that we associate with these depositional landforms are moraines. Moraines are the most common depositional landform that we will recognize for the alpine group. We recognize lateral moraines, which will form along the sides of glaciers, medial moraines that form across the center of converging glacial bodies, and terminal or end moraines that drop as alpine glacial bodies pause in their physical retreat. Terminal moraines represent physical points where new equilibriums are reached between glacial growth and the process of ablation. Take a moment and look back at this image, again, considering it to be a resource that can be compared to some of the imagery and diagrams associated with your readings, and look for some of these moraines, where they generally will form, how they will form, and what they might represent in terms of the condition of the glacial body. The last thing we'll take a look at in today's lecture are the erosional and depositional landforms that are associated with continental glaciers. The extent of the continental glacial bodies that we associate with, in this case, the late Pleistocene and the early Holocene in places like North America and Europe, is characterized by a combination of these two types of landforms, not unlike those that we have seen in a sense with the alpine group, simply on a greater scale. For example, a common feature of the late Pleistocene and Holocene epoch is the development of till plains. Till plains, in a sense, will be associated with end moraines. Generally, they will be unstratified, and we will find a good deal of coarse till in cross sections or profiles of these planar environments. Additionally, they will have little to no relief. They'll be low and rolling in nature. A second example of continental postglacial environments includes a variety of outwash plains. These are large tracts of land with well stratified glacial drift that features stream channels that were once fed by receding glacial meltwaters. These streams often have a braided or overloaded nature with regard to their movement of water and the load that they are carrying. Within outwash plains, we see additional features, things like kettles, for example. So these large meltwater features represent, in a sense, steep-sided depressions where physical remnants of glaciers were left behind. Large blocks, generally, of glacial ice were cleaved from the glacial body and, as I said, remained behind, melting in place and remaining a lake or kettle. And then drumlins are also very, very common features associated with continental glaciation. And again, they have qualities physically of the erosional processes that we associate with these large masses of ice, but then also how these large masses of ice, when they're receding or becoming smaller, are depositing the material that they are carrying, that is, in a sense, entrained within them. Drumlins generally are deposited in this case in a physical fashion that demarcates the direction of a glacier's retreat. They will taper toward the downstream portion of the retreating glacial body. Although this image depicts an alpine environment, still look at the end portion of the glacier itself, the kind of glacial tongue developing in this case with some of the terminal moraines or end deposits that are being labeled by your authors. Also take a look at then the location of, in this case, the outwash plain and the cross section of that outwash plain, and see how that is depicted as well, and cross-reference this again with your readings. So alpine glaciers, continental glaciers, these two major types or categories of glaciers associated with the late Pleistocene and the early Holocene are responsible for a majority of landscapes in the northern hemisphere, places, as I said before, like North America and Europe. And we do see remnants of their work also in the southern hemisphere, places like Central and South America. Glaciers, when present, and glaciers as they retreat and eventually disappear from landscapes, are a major factor in the landscapes themselves and their evolution. They are responsible for transforming the landscapes, and they are also responsible for creating new postglacial landscapes. So focus on those two concepts as you are continuing with your readings: periglacial processes and the work of glaciers themselves, and then postglacial landscapes and their nature.